Father, we just thank you, Lord, for this evening and, Lord, helping us to swim to church. Lord, I just pray that you would just meet us where we're at tonight, Lord. You met us in worship. Now I just ask you to meet us in your word. Lord, we just welcome you here, as Janie's already prayed, and just ask that you would move in our midst, work in our hearts and minds. Just yield to your spirit this evening. In Jesus' name. And open to 2 Samuel 14. Second Samuel 14. I wrestled how to go through the rest of these, or not the rest of these, but these next several chapters, because tonight as we come into chapter 14, we begin kind of a long single story. And I knew if I tried to take us through that many chapters, I'd put you to sleep. I thought about just doing kind of an outline, but then I felt like I'd be leaving too much of the story out. So the problem in the Old Testament is sometimes you get into these continuous stories that last chapters, and it's very hard to rest at any one point because you want to keep telling what happens next. So we'll probably make it through this chapter and maybe a little bit into the next, and we'll just have to rest just for time's sake. But if you remember last week, we closed out chapter 13 seeing this rift that took place between two of the sons of David, Amnon and Absalom. Amnon being the oldest and heir to the throne, and the one who decided to force himself sexually upon his half-sister, the full sister of Absalom. And Absalom goes on and schemes and then kills him off, and then David's left in distress for his dead son, and Absalom having fled to take refuge in another place. So we'll go back and we'll catch just the last few verses of 13 just to bring us into this section. But really beginning in 14 and especially 15, 16, 17, 18, all of those chapters are really just about this particular mess. And the truth is, I mean, really for the remainder of what we have here, it's about the mess that is David's family. And so much of it, we can't let his sons off the hook. They're of the age of accountability. They're making their own decisions. But having said that, we certainly can't leave David off the hook, because as their father, there were certainly many things that he's done wrong here. And so those last few verses there of 13, beginning in 37, it says, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon, because he was dead. So Absalom flees for his life to this place called Geshur, which last week I mentioned was in current day Syria. That's where his mother had lived, so it was familiar. Talmai was his maternal grandfather that was king. And so he lives in this place now for 3 years. We kind of talked there at the end that David is longing to see Absalom again. He seems to have come somewhat over his grief of Amnon due to the passing of time, but yet he has not reconciled with Absalom, and we'll see how that goes. You know, another thing about certain of the Old Testament stories, as a teacher, it's very hard sometimes to find application. It's just like a great story. And you got to tell it because it's the story within the book that we're in. And yet, I mean, I always, go before the Lord and say, okay, Lord, we need to apply this. How does this teach us? And I think subtly, and I've said it several times in this study, 1st, 2nd Samuel, a lot of this is just a real crude reminder of the nature of mankind. And many of us would say, well, we don't really need to be reminded. We see it, we hear about it, we've experienced it. And yet, here it is. And if we look around, I mean, it's everyday life. I mean, these kind of stories are just everyday life. Sometimes they involve us, sometimes they involve those around us, sometimes those we love, and sometimes people that we don't know, and yet we watch and we hear and we see their stories unfold. So we'll pick up verse 14, verse 1, or excuse me, chapter 14, verse 1. Just that first verse right now. It says, Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. This is another one of those human nature things. You know, it's so easy to look at someone like Joab and go, oh, Joab, you care so much for your king. And he does. And we talked a little bit about his personality last week, and as endearing as Joab can be to us, he's also conniving. He's always got something going where he's looking out for himself. But at least for a moment, he's thinking of the king, and he's thinking of ways to heal the rift that's here. And he realized that the king longed to have Absalom back in Jerusalem. But the people knew that Absalom was guilty of murder and should be executed. And the fear of the public disapproval kept David from bringing Absalom back. And I think this also, and I think we'll see this play out, although it's not mentioned specifically, this really weakened David's position, I believe, as king. I believe it weakened the confidence that the people had in their king. Because here's a man that's supposed to bring justice to his kingdom, and he's not doing it even within his own family. Pick up in verse 2. And Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning apparel. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who has been mourning a long time for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him in this manner. So Joab put words in her mouth. And when the woman of Tekoa spoke to the king, she fell on her face to the ground, prostrated herself, and said, help, O king. Then the king said to her, what troubles you? And she answered, indeed, I am a widow. My husband is dead. Now your maidservant had 2 sons, and the 2 fought with each other in the field, and there was no one to part them, but the one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole family has risen up against your maidservant, and they said, deliver him who struck his brother, that we may execute him for the life of his brother whom he killed, and we will destroy the heir also. So they would extinguish my ember that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the earth. And so Joab sends this woman from Tekoa, which was a place near Bethlehem, to David with a family situation similar to David's. And right off the bat, we can see the cleverness of this man using this woman, putting the words into her mouth, giving her a full script, telling her how she should act, behave, in the sense of not anointing yourself, smell. All to deceive the king and to really get Joab's wishes actually taken into account by the king. And so she pretends to be in deep mourning. She tells how one of her sons had killed the other, how her family was demanding the death of her only heir, and how this would completely wipe out the family name from the earth. You may have a question as to why is this woman before the king with such a situation? Well, in those days, we read very often about the men who met in the gate. You know, there were the officials of the city, the elders of the city would meet in the gate, and literally in the gate of the city would be offices where they would judge the things that were going on. So people had disputes, things that had things legally that needed to be decided. Well, if it ever got to the point where that was unsatisfactory, a person could request to go with their case before the king. And so that's how this happened. I'm sure Joab kind of greased the skids for that to take place. Let's pick up in verse 8. Then the king said to the woman, go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you. And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, my lord, O king, let the iniquity be on me and on my father's house, and the king and his throne be guiltless. So the king said, whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you anymore. Then she said, please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not permit the avenger of blood to destroy anymore, lest they destroy my son. And he said, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Therefore the woman said, please let your maidservant speak another word to my lord the king. And he said, say on. So the woman said, why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? For the king speaks this thing as one who is guilty, in that the king does not bring his banished one home again. Now we found out at the very beginning of this chapter, this was a wise woman. I think she's pretty brave as well. I'm amazed by how bold she is. I mean, she must have the guarantee of Joab that he's going to jump in and take over when the king tries to execute her or something, because she's being just straightforward and then actually brings accusation against the king for his own situation. And I love the way the Lord works with David. I mean, we saw this previously with Nathan. Nathan, who comes as the prophet before the king and gives this hypothetical situation which David judges, and then Nathan says as the prophet, this is you. And so here again, the very wisdom of the Lord coming down through people to David to wake him up to his own decisions and his own situation. So at first here, David tells her to return home and await an answer, maybe hoping to avoid guilt in acquitting the murderer. But she wanted an answer immediately, so she could trap David by his own decision. She offered to assume any guilt which his decision might involve. And then King David made another general statement promising his security for her. Then she asked him directly for assurance that her son would not be killed. As soon as he gave this, she had him trapped. If the king would grant this pardon to her son, why would he not restore his own banished son, Absalom? So the woman pretended in this situation, and it roughly corresponded to David's. One son is dead, and his relatives are calling for the death of the guilty one as a retribution and revenge. David's decision here showed mercy. It suspended the typical blood vengeance that would often continue down through many generations. It speaks about the avenger there. Remember, God set up that system, that if somebody in your family was killed, you could send an avenger after them. But there were also cities of refuge that someone could go to until their case was heard, to protect them. But the woman here presses on to apply the story to David and Absalom. And again, as with Nathan, as we just talked about a moment ago, David's caught in the web of his own moral wisdom. And now she goes on as if that wasn't enough. Verse 14, for we will surely die and become like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away life, but he devises means so that his banished ones are not expelled from him. So the woman here, she seems to suggest that like water spilled on the ground, what was done in the past, and in this case the death of Amnon, could not be salvaged. And she's saying, so why dwell on it? She's pointing out that life is too short to be wasted in a prolonged quarrel. And the last part of verse 14 seems to indicate that God does not immediately destroy an offender. And David should well know this, but devises means by which the sinner might be forgiven and restored. So it comes down to this: if God acts in this manner, why shouldn't the king? And that's where the challenge really comes for David. But David's no fool either. This isn't his first rodeo. Look at verse 15. Now therefore I have come to speak of this thing to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. And your maidservant said, I will now speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his maidservant. For the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the inheritance of God. Your maidservant said, the word of my lord the king will now be comforting. For as the angel of God, so is my lord the king in discerning good and evil. And may the Lord your God be with you. Verse 18, then the king answered and said to the woman, please do not hide from me anything that I ask you. And the woman said, please let my lord the king speak. So the king said, is the hand of Joab with you in all this? I wonder if he smirked or smiled and said that, and looked over at Joab. And the woman answered and said, as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. For your servant Joab commanded me, and he put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant. You can hear the bus running over him. To bring about this change of affairs, your servant Joab has done this thing. But my Lord is wise, according to the wisdom of the angel of God, to know everything that is in the earth. And the king said to Joab, "All right, I have granted this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom." Then Joab fell to the ground on his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord, O king, and that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant." So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. So the woman here says that she came to the king expecting such divine forgiveness. She obtained it for her own son, and now she was pleading for David's son. And the king suspected that Joab had engineered the plot, and the woman freely admitted that was the case. David weakly orders Joab to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem in spite of the fact that he's still unrepentant. So this was not a righteous act for David to really do. And he certainly was going to pay for it. Let's pick up in 24. And the king said, "Let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face." So Absalom returned to his own house, but did not see the king's face. Now in all Israel there was no one who praised as much as Absalom for his, there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head at the end of every year, he cut it because it was heavy on him. When he cut it, he weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels according to the king's standard. To Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. And Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. Therefore Absalom sent to Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again a second time, he would not come. So he said to his servants, "See, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and came to Absalom's house and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" And Absalom answered Joab, "Look, I sent to you, saying, 'Come here, so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come to Geshur? It would be better for me to be still there, or there still. Now therefore, let me see the king's face, but if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me.' So Joab went to the king and told him. And when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. Then the king kissed Absalom. So 2 full years Absalom lives in Jerusalem, hasn't been permitted to be in his father's presence at all. And it seems that his natural good looks, and by the words here, his luxurious growth of hair, no jealousy on my part, are mentioned as factors that would aid him in stealing the hearts of the people of Israel. And that may seem crazy. I mean, why even put that in there? But let's remember from 1 Samuel. Recall how all Israel was attracted to King Saul because he was very good looking and taller than everybody else. And so there was something about the looks. And I think it's funny, I mean, they mention his hair. They mention that he cuts it at the end of every year. And then they even give the weight of his hair. And it depends on the king's standard, but depending on the king's standard, it could have been as much as 6 pounds of hair. Lucky him. Anyway. But it must have been a lot. I mean, if you got to get sheared once a year because there's too much to carry around. Interesting. So after 2 years, Absalom tried to contact Joab for permission to see the king. We find out here he refuses him twice. Absalom has a fire sale with his property, and then suddenly he shows up very quickly. And then Absalom's request for an audience with the father was granted, and the two were reunited. Now, looking back, it had been 7 years since Tamar had been raped, and 5 years since the murder of Amnon. So that means for 5 years, Absalom has not seen his father David at all. And though David had not forgiven him and brought him back to Jerusalem instead of executing him, he had refused to forget what had happened. And yet when the two finally met, Absalom received a complete pardon. And I'm thinking as that word trickled out through the kingdom, that couldn't have gone very well either. I mean, let's face it, even in our own day, when we see the law applied to the citizen and not to those who are in charge, we have a bit of aggravation. to put it lightly. Why are the laws for some and not for others? And I would think this would be the same case here amongst the people in David's kingdom. He then took the favor of his father had shown him, and he uses it as a platform from which to launch a revolution. And really that revolution we read about in chapters 15 and 16 and 17 and 18. So David spares his son, but in response, Absalom plots his father's death. Now, think about Joab's actions one more time. You know, it seems designed to obtain David's favor, but also the favor of Absalom at the same time. He's playing both sides, because David is the current king, and Absalom is the one who would be king. And so Joab's playing it very safe. We'll go just a little bit into the 15th chapter. Verse 1, it says, "And this had happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him." So he got dad's credit card, and he begins to run with it. Verse 2, "Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was, whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom would call to him and say, 'What city are you from?' And he would say, 'Your servant is from such and such, a tribe of Israel.' Then Absalom would say to him, 'Look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you.' Moreover, Absalom would say, 'Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, then I would give him justice.' And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. In this matter, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel." So previously, Absalom had not revealed his desire to be king. But now we see him traveling about with this impressive entourage. And he also was so bold as to set up in the city gate, which we just talked about a moment ago, where the legal matters were settled. And he acted as if he were the only one in Israel who was genuinely interested in the welfare of the people. He was a politician, shaking hands, kissing babies. He practically accused his father of failure to provide adequate legal aid and said that if he were king, the people would receive the justice they deserved. So he courted the favor of the people from the various cities of Israel. Let's pick up in 7. This will be the last part that we do. "Now it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said to the king, 'Please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord. For your servant took a vow while I dwelt in Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord indeed brings me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord.' And the king said to him, 'Go in peace.' So he rose and went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron.' And with Absalom went 200 men invited from Jerusalem, and they went along innocently and did not know anything. Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from the city, from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy grew, for the people with Absalom continually increased in numbers." Now, one thing I want us to notice is in verse 7, it says that after 40 years. It doesn't seem logical that this was 40 years later, right? So some of the thoughts are maybe this was Absalom's age at this time, after 40 years of life. He's now 40 years old. Some believe that this is a minor corruption of the text, that it should read 4 years. And based on the readings in a couple of the old ancient translations, the Arabic translations, the Syriac translations, that would seem to be the case. Also, we could probably prove that from Josephus's historical accounts, and even some of the Hebrew manuscripts would back up that it's just 4 years, after 4 years. So Absalom receives permission to go to Hebron, apparently to fulfill the vow he had made while he was in exile. At least that was the case that he presented to his father. Now Hebron, the city, the leadership there was probably disgruntled, because if you think about it, David had moved his capital from there to Jerusalem. So he'd already taken from them, so they were probably ripe to join with Absalom in whatever he wanted to do. And then 200 men who accompanied Absalom, they didn't even know the real purpose in what was going on, was to announce the formation of a new government. with himself as the king. And then this Ahithophel was one of David's counselors. Also note this, he was Bathsheba's grandfather. Bathsheba, the one that David stole and made pregnant and then killed her husband. So that probably made a difference. Perhaps Ahithophel wanted to get even with David because of his sin with his granddaughter, which may have made him easily turn from David to his son now. So, as I mentioned earlier, application is hard here. Beyond further examples of the corrupt nature of fallen men, the penalty of ignoring God's wisdom and instruction. But we could also see application here as yet another reminder of how fickle the human heart can be. Now, you may not need that reminder. You may have experienced that. But the truth is, the hearts of men, the hearts of women are definitely fickle in their loyalties to others. And it's interesting, if you've had that experience or you've seen it in other places, how fast loyalties can be spoiled and how fast alliances will shift depending upon the advantage of going to a different side or following someone else. Now, Absalom endears himself to the people, and he won many friends by that. Again, politician. I don't watch such things because I don't need any more aggravation. But if you were to watch something like, was it last night, the debates, the Democratic debates? I don't know how many were on stage, but they all should have been in Santa suits because they're promising everything to everyone, especially special interest groups, just to get them to vote. And so we see that political bent here. And people are going to go where they're going to get the most, unfortunately, so often. But his rapid success at influencing the minds and hearts of a nation warns us that one day, and this is where I think maybe the largest application as we get into this story, when we think about just that influence over the minds of heart of people, of over really an entire nation, that warns us that one day a leader will arise who will control the minds and people all across the earth. Many people think that day is coming very fast. And we need to be those, even as believers, that are aware of that we're prayed up, that we're studied up, we're armored up, to know that deception will come upon the entire earth. And whether we're here or not, I can't explain how that's all going to work in the timeline. I have my guesses. But if we're at least a little bit into that time frame, we still have a responsibility as believers to make sure that we're not deceived. It speaks about that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I'm going to read from two places about that individual that's coming that's going to deceive the whole world. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worship, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." That's an event that will come. It's a future event that will come. And there are many ways to explain that we might not be here to see it as believers. But I can make just as great an argument that we might see part of it. And I don't want us to take a chance that we won't. And so we need to know what the signs will be. A few verses later, verse 9, it says, "The coming of the lawless one is according to the workings of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who do not believe the truth but have pleasure in righteousness." Those verses seem to indicate that deception is more on those that never believe. And that'll definitely be going into the tribulation period, because as I believe, and if we're right, the tribulation beginning with the rapture of believers wouldn't be there for that part. But we don't know how early on that one that's speaking of here will come on the scene. And people have made so many guesses over the years. There's those that believe they know who it's going to be. They believe that he might be here now, that he's at least been born now. And personal opinion, I mean, I think they're about 99.9% of the guesses are wrong. Because I know who it is. But I will say this about that individual. When you consider, if you're so inclined, to even guess who it might be, remember what the Bible says about that individual. That they were, they are not now, and will be again. It's very interesting. So for it to be someone that has no history doesn't make any sense. Because it's somebody that was and is not now, but will be again. And so, scary on your little exploration of that. I have my opinions. So also understand, even the people of Israel will be deceived. And they're even going to sign a covenant with this ruler. And then he will turn on them and seek to destroy them. Which is why we see in the tribulation period, second half, after that one has proclaimed himself to be God and set up his image in the temple, that the Jewish people, the remnant of them, will flee somewhere for safety. It talks about that in Daniel, chapter 9, verse 26 and 7. It says, "And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood until the end of the war desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, that final 7 years. That has not happened yet. But in the middle of the week, the middle point of the tribulations, 3.5 years in, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, because he'll set up the sacrifice to himself on the altar in the temple. And on the wings of abominations, because he brings in the sacrifice of the swine, shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. And so even they will be deceived. You know, it's interesting too, as soon as we get into these end times and we start thinking, as we did over the last week, about the possibilities of war, and we start going into, as I taught a couple Sundays ago, you know, we start looking at Ezekiel 37 and Ezekiel 38, and Jeremiah chapter 17, and other places. One of the things about that final battle that sometimes we get all worked up about, here it is. It says something very interesting about Israel. And it says that Israel will be, at that time, will be living in unwalled cities. We're not there yet. So that says to me, at least possibly, I'm not saying it is, that war that we all think could happen before the tribulation may very well come after, because that means that Israel would find itself, at least even in a deceived state, that they're at peace. Because they're not going to live in an unwalled city unless they think they're at peace. And so that's just something to consider. When would that come about? When would they get to the point where they were an unwalled city? Because currently today, I mean, we talk about trying to build a wall on our southern border. I mean, they are a walled city, and they have proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that walls work. Now, Jesus told the Jewish leaders about this day as well. In John chapter 5, verse 43, Jesus says, "I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, him you will receive." And so he was warning them even back then about this one that is coming. And then I think this warning now stands for all of us. Matthew chapter 24, verse 4, Jesus says, "Take heed that no one deceives you." And every time that topic comes up, I bring up the issue that some argue, and there's no other word I can use it, that as believers, we can't be deceived. Well, I believe if in the moment the deception comes, if we're dialed in 101% to the Spirit of God, probably not. I don't know how often you're dialed in 101% to the Spirit of God. And so many of things of the world attract our attention, and we're fascinated by, and we listen to, and we wonder, could it be true? Right now, the lies that are coming down the pike are just convincing, and there's many, and there will be many more. There was just new news today about, once again, about our origins being sown from outer space. It was in Fox News today. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, you know. And so many of those things are going to get legs. And I believe sooner than later, we're going to start to see those things get legs, especially the whole, as I've talked about before, the whole alien deception. It's going to get legs very fast. And we've basically had disclosure, in case you haven't been paying attention. We've had what I would call a soft disclosure. We have the military showing videos of things flying in the air that they can't explain. You know, they've now changed the term from UFO to UAP, now an unexplained aerial phenomenon, much softer. And I think sooner than later we're going to see them come around with the rest of the story. They found life somewhere out there, and they'll start to begin to talk about how it seeded us here. One more time, trying to bring a blanket over creation and forward the madness of science. But I digress, or maybe not. You're either tired or shocked. We'll rest there for tonight.